Hello and welcome to this short session on making history stick, feedback strategies that work. I think this probably could be used by colleagues outside of history as well, but I've tried to tie it a little bit more specifically to history for this session. So my name is Emily Pringle. I am a subject lead for history in an independent school in Lincolnshire. This is part of a year-long research project that I did at my previous school, which was a state school in North Lincolnshire. And I spoke about this at Research Ed as well, and what I've done now is kind of made a shorter version of this. However, resources that are relevant to both history and cross-teaching are available in my G Drive, and I'm more than happy to share those. So the point of today's session is to think about the principles of effective feedback, explore the ideas of live marking and whole class feedback, particularly in history, and to leave with practical resources to actually implement those strategies. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to take away something specific and practical that you can go away and make a small change that you can prepare ready for September effectively. So the first thing to kind of start with is feedback versus marking. So I think as teachers, we often get stuck in a trap of marking, feeling like we have to make marks on a page for the time we spend looking at students' work to be valid. And whether that is because we're trying to prove that we're actually looking at that work to parents, to teachers, to SLT, to students, or not, is not really the issue here. The fact is that a lot of the time we need to consider whether or not the marks that we make on a page are actually doing anything to make our students better, because essentially that's what we need to be doing. We need to be making our students better, helping them to make progress over time. And for me, I feel that marking is very much about that making marks on a page, making comments, corrections, really quick corrections like about spag and things like that. And that's absolutely fine. There is a place for that. But I think we need to be thinking more about the comments, if we are going to make them. What is the impact of that? Are we just doing it for the sake of doing it? Does our marking actually move students on? Or do we actually need to be starting to think slightly differently about this? And this is really where I want to focus, this idea of giving information about performance, guidance on overcoming misconceptions, those next steps, and this being part of an ongoing process. And what I should have prefaced this talk with saying is that actually I have not taken home a set of books since October 2023 when I started this trial. So the only marking that I do is whole class feedback and live marking, and I have only taken exam papers home during that time to actually mark. Any book marking has been entirely managed to be done within school working hours. So here's how I've done it effectively. So why? So I think there are three key things here, and I think the HA puts this idea of history, so the subject aspect of it. The EEF gives us basically that key message of that actually our feedback has to be usable and it needs to be done in a timely manner. And then I think Dylan William there is saying that actually that's what the impact of our feedback should be. It shouldn't be about, oh, I've done really well or I've done badly. It should be about, okay, what do I do next? It should be that thinking hard. And if we think back to obviously that definition of learning as a change in long-term memory, and we know that our memory is we only create memory if we think really hard about something, then it's the same for feedback. In order for students to get better, they need to be thinking hard about what it is they need to do, and we need to be guiding them to do that. One of the things that I've said most recently after our end of year exams is that actually the feedback that we're doing in the lesson is as important, if not more important, than the actual exam, because that gave me information, but now it's how we use that information that's really important. And I think we have to bear in mind the very subject-specific elements that we have in history. So, for example, we know that in history, we have quite a long pieces of work to mark. Now, yes, they can be shorter, but it's not a very quick right or wrong answer. We're looking at the quality of thinking, we're looking at the quality of communication, we're trying to build those historical skills. And I think that sometimes it leads us to being quite generic, and we just kind of focus on those kind of P paragraphs, and we kind of forget about those historical skills. Equally, if we're making individualized comments on it, it can take us so long to give it back to the students that it's of no longer of any relevance, and what they were doing in that point has gone. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't leave a delay between feedback. The EEF talks about feedback being timely, but that is dependent on the context of the piece of work and everything else. And I will come on to that in just a few moments. And so I think what we need to be really thinking about is how do we make feedback work in our classroom as history teachers and for them to get better at history. And I think there are a couple of key things that we need to put into place. As I said, those principles of feedback. The first thing is that we need to lay the foundations for effective feedback with high quality initial teaching that includes careful formative assessment. And for me, what this essentially means is we need to backwards plan. We need to consider what it is we want to assess students on. So what is the point of that unit, that scheme of work, that year, or whatever it is? What is the thing that we want to test students on? We then need to create a task that allows us to do that. We need to be very crystal clear about what the learning objectives are, i.e. what we want to get to, and also how we want to get to that. So what the success criteria are. And what is even more important there is that we then share this with the students as well. There has to be that open communication. This is where we're heading. This is what good looks like. This is how we're going to get there. Here are our success criteria. And then we need to use that formative assessment along the way to help them to get to it. Once they've done that piece of work, we need to give that appropriately timed feedback, which I'm going to talk about live marking in a minute, may well be in the moment feedback. Equally, it could be the following week. Whatever it is, as long as it is appropriately timed and it moves learners forward, that's the main aim here. The Inner Drive team created a lovely infographic about when should you provide feedback and for which types of tasks. So I'd check that out if I were you. And then we need to plan for how pupils will receive and use feedback. And that's coming back to that idea that Dylan Williams said about how it should create thinking, not an emotional reaction. We need to plan in time for those students to use the feedback, and we need to be very crystal clear on how they're going to do that. There is no point as thinking about this feedback as the end product if we have not put all of those steps in before, and if we don't give them time to actually respond to it. Feedback and what we want to feedback on should be what is driving our lessons and our curriculum planning. It should not be an addition or an add-on or something that we do in addition to the main tasks. It needs to be considered right from the very beginning. And so here I think it's really helpful to think about three key questions. We've got that feeding up, where am I going? Like, what is it that we want to do? So again, coming back to that learning intentions, success criteria, what a good one looks like, those key things. And then we look at how are they going? So if the feeding up is our end goal, the how am I going? The feedback is the journey. So that's through like the small pieces of writing that you'll do in the lead up to a big one, or through the mini source assessments that you do, or any of those key things. But in history, it's about all those little checks for understanding, making sure that in the moment they're doing the things that they need to do to help them improve. And that's where live marking comes into place. And then finally, which I think is more along the lines of the summative assessment, is we look at feeding forward. We are giving them information that is going to help them in the future, that is going to help them to move forward, those next steps. And those need to be crystal clear. It needs to not just be add more detail. Well, what kind of detail? We need to specify that. It needs to be specific, which means that we need a name, a date, an event, a person. You're giving them that kind of information. You know, how else to link back at the end by using connectives to assess the extent of change and continuity by talking about and adding in words. So making it very, very history specific in that feedback, not generic. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is live marking and feedback. And this is marking and feedback that is done in the moment, either with the students standing over their shoulder as you circulate the room, maybe sitting with them if it's a slightly longer piece. But this is essentially about supporting students to get better at that moment, and it massively cuts down on workload. What I found when I started using this is misconceptions that I wouldn't have picked up on until I'd taken in their books 3 or 4 weeks later. I was able to correct in the moment, which meant they were automatically making more progress in their subject knowledge, which meant they could then apply it to their written work, which shows that they were making progress overall. So again, to re-emphasise this, where we start is with a clear learning objective and success criteria. Students and teachers know the goal of the lesson. And I think preparation for live marking is almost as important as the marking itself. You need to have that, what is the aim, how are we going to get there, model those examples, and then we need to plan for independent practice. You need to have planned something that is going to allow them to get into that flow state. And you need to be very explicit about how and what it is you want them to do, and making sure that you're using all of those great key teacher techniques like chunking and front loading the means of participation, but being crystal clear on what it is you want them to do. Once you're at that point and you've set them off, stand and watch them. If you automatically start walking around, they haven't had time to get started, so it panics some of them. And equally, they're not yet settled. Wait for that 3 minutes, and it means that they have settled, they are starting to write, and then pick who and where you're going to. So if you know that there are students who struggle to get started, target them first, because you might just need to give them a little sentence starter and then they can crack on with it. And that's the other key thing. Take a pen with you. Always take a pen so that you can write down if you need it. But not all live feedback needs to be written. Some of it can be verbal as well. And William in 2018 said that the most powerful feedback happens during the task. And I think particularly with history, where small mistakes like who did what, or the date of something, or whether or not it's the right monarch, that can have a massive impact on their understanding of the chronology or how things link together. And so actually being able to pick on those misconceptions right at that moment is key, and actually can be really powerful. So if we move on from this, then what we look at here is that I've got a few examples. So here you can see that above, that student was talking about before and after. So this was about changing continuity, and this is the frame that I wanted them to use. Now, in year 7, when we first get them, a lot of the time they literally go, before it was this and after it was this. This is a piece of year 7 work where they'd been starting to describe what it was a little bit more, but you can see where I've said use control and castle. I don't just want them to say what was there before, no castles, and what was there after, Mott and Bailey castles. I want them to tell me why it was there. So that idea of linking to control. And that's what they then went on to do. In this one, this is a year 9 one, students were talking about the different causes of World War II, and they were drawing significant circles to show the relative significance of each of them. So World War I, and what you can see is I've said, this is what you've done really well, so here's the great evidence, and up above it says this is important because they hadn't actually put that in. So, and then what they've done is then add that in as well, and this is a low prior attaining group of students, so adding in just that link was a really big step for them. This is a year 10 piece of work, so I was live marking as I went through the lesson. What this meant was that actually I could pick up on where they were doing things really well, showing them where they've done their infer or their knowledge, which then they could automatically apply to the next piece of work that they were doing. And this is key. So sometimes with year 7, I will give them 3 different sources to look at, and they'll just work their way through those 3 sources. But through stopping the class and addressing misconceptions, or through getting around most of them, they're automatically making that progress throughout the lesson. And then you've got this one here where you can see there's nothing actually written by me at all here. This would have been a verbal conversation that I had, and where they've gone and then made those changes to make those improvements. And this leads me on to whole class feedback, which has saved me so much time over the years. And this is essentially what I would do after a longer piece of work, after maybe a summative assessment, or even just where they've written a paragraph where they're kind of bringing lots of different ideas together. And what you do in this one is you read a whole set of books, but you're not making copious amounts of notes on everybody's book. You might correct some spag, you might give a little praise or things, but actually the general feedback goes to everyone, so that you've got that the quality of the feedback is higher because you've not stretched yourself writing lots of information. You've been able to prepare for whatever activity is going to move them on. So again, you start with that clear learning objective and success criteria. They know the goal of that piece of work. I tend to read through between 5 and 7 pieces of work, and that tends to give me the scale of what we're looking at. You'll know as teachers, you can pretty much read a few books and go, yeah, those are going to be my 3 comments. And that's then what I would make notes on, those misconceptions and the areas for development, but also the strengths. And then I would feed that back through a pro forma. At my previous school, I would have just done this on the board. They would have used their purple pen to show that they've responded to some marking. But here we print them off, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. I'd model excellence, and I think actually this is really key. If you're giving feedback on a piece of work and they've gone wrong on it, they're not going to know how to get it better if you don't remind them of what excellence was for that. And again, it's this time to feed forward. If you don't give time, it's not going to work. So let's have a look at some examples. So here are some generic examples. There's lots of pro formas you can use to kind of make your notes on it. This is one that I really like because it talks about praise, misconceptions. I always put some key spellings on there, and then I've got model answers. And this was for, I think, an end of unit assessment. So I've got some students needed to focus on question 2, some needed to focus on question 3. I might write this in the lesson, having pre-prepared it, or I might have this already pre-prepared and ready to go. And then you can see those tasks there. And the students would have received a code, so 1, 2, or 3, and that's what they would need to do. And we can look at what this looks like in a book in a minute. Another way that I really like doing, and this is the way, so the formative assessment one there, that's very much like almost a faculty-wide pro forma. But what I've done is I have started to colour code, and I would do this in the lesson in front of them. So where it says give an overall reason, they can then see where that has been done in that model answer. So when they're using that model answer to get better, they can look at it and see what it is that they didn't do that is maybe missing, because it's been linked directly to those EBI, those improvement tasks. And you can see there was 5 improvement tasks. And then one way that I've actually changed it for my GCSE students is, you can see question C there. We do Cambridge IGCSE, so it's ABC. And so I've got one for each of those. And again, I would highlight the things that they've done well, and then I would give them one of those improvement tasks. So I would make those sheets having read it and then just highlight and go through them. And this is what it looks like in the books. So you can see that is in there. On the right hand side, you can see that a student has actually annotated that one themselves as we've gone through, that they've then, or the only writing that I've done in there is I've done a little comment on that one, but then we've got what went well and even better if, and they know then what they need to do to make those improvements. And in terms of the impact of this, so this is from students at my previous schools. At the end of the year, after I've done this whole trial, I asked them to state how far you agree or disagree with those statements. There was very few disagreements with it, but I think you can see the strength there of the whole class feedback in particular, and the use of model answers, and also having clear learning objectives, because we've done some work on that year as well. And actually it meant that they were very clear on what they were doing, on how to do it, and then getting feedback on how to get even better. And so this was really promising for me in terms of taking this to the next steps. At the school I'm at now, it's really helped to adapt a new culture. So one of the things that has come from middle leaders, these are quotations from middle leaders, is that the students now expect that they're going to do something with the feedback, that they appreciate that reflective time. It's this which actually helps their progress, but because we've implemented this way of doing it, it means that it's really clear in their books, and it means that we are prioritising time for that as well. And we're seeing that students aren't making the same errors over and over again across lots of faculties, because they're having more regular feedback. So to come back to those 3 elements, we can see how those all work. We can see how they all work within the history classroom as well. And it's about making sure that those things are there. The EEF says it's not necessarily about the way in which you feedback, whether you do written, whether you do live, or whatever it is, it's the quality of what you're doing and whether or not those feedback principles underpin it. So there's some reflection questions here for you to go away and think about. And on the next slide, you can see there are lots of resources there to share, and some extra reading as well. But go away and think about, what difference does the marking you do now make to your students? What feedback approaches are actually helping students make progress? And please do share, I would love to hear them. And what challenges do you face? And if you're thinking, oh, I don't know how I'd even go about starting with live marking, there's some really nice resources that I've created, including like a frequently asked question one that will help. So let's wrap up here, and so I'll say thank you very much for your time today. If you are going to make any changes, it would be amazing if you would let me know. Let's hear some feedback from that, and I'd love to hear how it goes. Let's all work together to hopefully make history stick for our students. Thank you and goodbye.